We are very pleased and honored to be able to have a discussion with Professor John Hedley Brooke. Since listing all your accomplishments in a limited time span is next to impossible, could I ask you to introduce yourself?
Well, yes, I am John Hedley Brooke, as you say. I had a background in my education studying the sciences. I was lucky enough to get a place in Cambridge in the early 1960s. After graduating in the natural sciences, I had developed an interest in the history and philosophy of science. And so I did my doctorate in the history of 19th century organic chemistry. So gradually I moved from working in laboratories to working in libraries. I taught for a while at the University of Sussex, which was one of the new universities founded in England during the 1960s. But I fairly quickly moved to the north of England, to the University of Lancaster, another of the new universities, and joined a thriving young history department to teach the history of science there. And it was a very congenial department. I got to know lots of people in other disciplines, religious studies and the sciences. And it was there that I first started teaching courses on science and religion. I did some consultancy work for the Open University, which was just coming into life in the early 1970s. I stayed in Lancaster for 30 years. It's a very beautiful part of England. And was then astonished in 1999 when I was asked to take the new chair in science and religion in Oxford. But that's not the sort of invitation you turn down, even though I recognized it would be a lot of work. So I had 7 very, I won't say stressful years, very enthusiastic years actually, launching the master's program in science and religion in Oxford and doing a lot of teaching and research while I was there. I've been retired now since 2006. But as with most academics, retirement does not mean retirement. And it's been a great pleasure to be part of this project that we're talking about today.
Thank you for these kind words. You preempted a bit the question already, but Professor Brooke, you are one of the most prominent scholars in the field of religion and science. How did you decide to work on this subject?
To explain how I became really drawn into the field of religion and science, I'm not sure that I can give an explanation that would be totally accurate or true, because we all face difficulties reconstructing our own autobiographies. I think that in my own case, because I was involved in the sciences from school, I was very interested in the way science impacts with wider culture. At the same time, in my late teenage years, I did move in certain religious circles. I became very interested in Protestant Christian traditions. And so almost inevitably, I was asking myself questions about how an education in science fits with an involvement in a religious community of some kind. When I went to Cambridge, I remained a student of the sciences, but as in school, I developed this keen interest in the history and philosophy of science. Partly, I think, because I believed that it would shed some light on the questions I was asking about the relationship between advances in science and what many people, of course, see as a retreat of religion as a consequence of the science. And what I discovered when I began studying the history and philosophy of science in some depth was that, particularly looking at the 17th century, the period we often call the scientific revolution, in that period, the presentation of new scientific ideas was very often done through the language of theology. In other words, there was a certain kind of fusion of scientific and theological discourse. And I found that very different from the kind of popular image that one often sees, namely that religion and science are competitors, that there will be some inevitable conflict. And in a modern secular age, the majority view, I guess, would be that science has prevailed and in certain respects triumphed over conservative, reactionary religion.
Were there any influential books or scholars that inspired you when you first got drawn into history of science and then into science and religion in general?
There were, certainly, and I think one springs to mind because it was a book that I read even before applying to go to Cambridge. It was a book actually by an Oxford theoretical chemist, and his name was Charles Coulson. He was also a Methodist preacher. What was interesting about the book he wrote, which was called Science and Christian Belief, or Science and Christian Faith, I don't remember quite accurately there, he developed the very interesting argument that the way science and religion are often seen is that the science somehow displaces the theology, that science gives us a better explanation than religion gives us for the way we find the world. But he was arguing that that is a very inadequate, and actually from a theological point of view, a disastrous position to adopt, because it encourages people to believe in a kind of God of the gaps. If there's something that science has not yet explained, it may be tempting for the theologian to say, well, it's God. That gives us the explanation. And Coulson very forcefully argued that that is a mistake. The theologian should not fall into that trap of the God of the gaps. Because, of course, as science progresses further, the gaps in our explanatory apparatus may gradually close. And then the theologian is left in a very embarrassing position because they've invested in the inexplicability of a phenomenon, which then turns out to be explicable after all. So Coulson's book and that attack on the God of the gaps, that did have a big impression, made a big impression on me. And I remember wanting to quote from it in my entrance examination for Cambridge because I thought that might actually impress my examiners if I could produce a nice little argument like that. Once I got into the history and philosophy of science at Cambridge, there were other books. I remember one by Edwin Arthur Burt called The Metaphysical Foundations of Modern Physical Science. And that was very impressive because it showed how figures during the scientific revolution, figures like Kepler, Descartes, Newton, how their science was very much interrelated with deep philosophical assumptions about the nature of knowledge and the nature of the physical world. So metaphysics, theology, and science seemed to be very interconnected, particularly in the 17th century. Later, I realized, of course, once you get into the 18th and 19th centuries, you get a distillation out, and some of these fields become more clearly separated. And it's very important to recognize that. But I think that was an important book. Thomas Kuhn's book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, that was published in 1962, the year in which I began my studies in Cambridge. And I remember being very excited by Kuhn's analysis, where he argues that the development of science is not just a steady accumulation of facts. One has to look at the theoretical superstructures in which those facts are embedded. And sometimes those theoretical structures suffer a challenge on a very fundamental scale. Kuhn used the language of paradigms being in collision when innovative ideas challenged what had become an established paradigm. And I just thought that his critique of this notion that science progresses just by accumulating facts about the world, I found that a very convincing critique. So that's 3 books I've mentioned: Coulson, Burt, Kuhn. They were certainly formative. On the religious side, there were books by theologians that made quite a deep impression on me. And I guess for a while, one of the most important of those would have been Karl Barth, whom I studied in translation at that stage. But he was a very influential Protestant theologian and who had very controversial views on natural theology. So there was, again, a rather interesting tension between what I was reading in theology and what I was discovering through the history of science.
This gives me the leave to move on to the next question, which is that you have written extensively on a number of subjects, one of which is actually natural theology and its relation to both science and religion and the total science and religion interaction. Would you like to present your views on this topic, natural theology and its relation to the science and religion interaction?
Right, I shall do my best. But natural theology is a rather difficult concept, and that's partly because it has had many different manifestations, and it certainly can mean different things to different people, even today. Just a couple of years ago, the University of Oxford Press produced a huge handbook on natural theology, which discovers an enormous range of subjects and initiatives that fall under that description. Basically, I regard natural theology as an enterprise in which the attempt is made to learn something about the existence and the nature of God on the basis of natural reason rather than revelation. But that is only one definition, and that only gets us a very short way down the road. If we talk for a moment about what that could mean for science, there is a view, I think, and I have a lot of sympathy with it, that the Christian cultures that supported science in the 17th century did so in part because they recognized that studying the natural world and using God's gift of reason to study the natural world was a way in which you could bring glory to God. You could study the wisdom built into creation through the laws that the divine legislator had set up. There was, I think, a very strong belief in the late 17th century, right through to the mid-19th century, that there was evidence of design in nature. When you looked at living things, their parts, their organs seemed to kind of cohere together to make life meaningful. And certainly just thinking of something like the human eye, for example, it could be construed as the work of a craftsman. So one of the main arguments of natural theology over 200 years and more was what we call the argument from design. One looked at the beak of a woodpecker, the human eye, one looked at even the hump of a camel, which had the function of carrying water for it through the desert. Those kind of contrivances, designs in nature, seemed to point to some kind of supernatural intelligence. That argument was severely compromised. It wasn't destroyed, but it was severely compromised in the 19th century when evolutionary theories began to give an alternative account for these beautiful adaptations in nature. So I think in connection with the science, I would say natural theology did not only encourage the study of nature because it would bring glory to God, but in so doing, it also helped to make science socially respectable. And at that juncture, I think one has to say that that is not always recognized. But in the 17th century, for example, the examination of nature, the attempt to exploit nature, often smacked of some kind of magic. And that was not socially respectable. You know, the idea that you should exploit nature for your own gains. And I think what a Christian natural theology did do in the 17th century was helped to confer some social respectability on the pursuit of science. It was appropriate even for a cleric to study God's creation. So there are interesting links between the science and the natural theology. From the point of view of theology and on the religious side, arguments for God's existence, of which there have been many, of course have always played an important part in the apologetic defense of religious traditions. And certainly in Christian traditions, there has been a determined effort to disprove atheism and to try to demonstrate that the more we know about the natural world, the more it points to a creator of some kind. On the other hand, natural theology has often been criticized from within religious communities because it can be presented, can be seen almost as a distraction from a more spiritual response to nature. And I think we do see something of that in the Orthodox tradition. A movement like the Hesychast movement is one where spiritual values have priority. The main thing is to try to lead to some union with God. And the study of nature is seen more as a distraction than something which has strong religious motivation and support. So natural theology from a theological point of view has this rather awkward setting. It's often approved and welcomed when it lends support to the tradition, but it's also seen as something which can, for example, distract the believer away from a focus on God and Christology, if one's talking about the Christian tradition, and to become seduced by the interest in studying nature. And there are studies, I think, which have shown us that some of the clerical figures who became deeply involved in science did have a kind of split loyalty, to the extent that they were anxious that they were not being quite loyal to what was expected of them. So there's a lot one could say about natural theology from both a scientific perspective and a theological perspective. But if one is looking at the relationship between science and religion, then natural theology has been probably the most important bridge.
You've already mentioned evolutionary accounts in relation to natural theology and how they affected some of your arguments. Now you have written on Darwin and his legacy and his work. And how do you believe that Darwin and Darwinism has affected the science and religion interaction?
I think most people, if they were asked to comment on which scientific developments of the last 300 years have had the most impact on how the public, as well as intellectuals, have understood the relationship between God and nature. I'm sure Darwin would be at the top of the list for many. That's not to say that cosmology has been irrelevant. It certainly hasn't. But I think what created many problems for 19th century thinkers was the fact that Darwin's theory in particular had implications for how one looked at the development of humankind. When one's talking about physics or the more cosmological sciences, the issues often are quite abstract. You know, the beauty of the world, or the applicability of mathematical modes of analysis. But when one comes to evolutionary theory, suddenly human beings, we ourselves, are at the center of the story. And so I think it's impossible really to discuss the relations between science and religion, certainly in the post-Darwinian period, without taking seriously into account not only Darwin's theory of common descent, that we all have common ancestors, going back possibly just to one or very few original life forms. Not only that, but I think what was disruptive too was the mechanism that Darwin proposed. Now actually Darwin proposed several mechanisms, and to focus only on natural selection, which is the customary thing to do, can easily miss the importance of some of the other ideas that he had that were contributing to species transformation. But there's no doubt, particularly in the first edition of The Origin, he tends to place natural selection. That's his great original contribution. He places that right at the center of attention and argument. And the problem then is, I think, that when you start looking at the history of life forms on Earth, you recognize that in the first place, there doesn't seem a simple linear trajectory. It's a tree, this evolutionary diversification. It could almost look as if this was the result of a random process and not a carefully pre-designed progress. So that was one issue. But I think also looking at natural selection as the mechanism, that sense that there is some kind of inevitable warfare, conflict, competition between living things for very limited resources. It somehow paints a picture of the world which is very different from the natural theology we were talking about a few minutes ago. William Paley, who is the classic exponent of the English natural theology tradition, argued in his famous book of 1802, Natural Theology, he argued that it's really a happy world. Everything, you know, on a summer evening in an English vicarage garden, the bees are humming, the birds are singing, the world is a happy place. What Darwin discovered on his intellectual as well as physical voyage around the world during the 1830s was that when you visited other parts of the world, it was not like Paley's vicarage garden. There were earthquakes, volcanoes, many, many fossil forms of species that had become extinct. It just conjured up a vision that for Darwin himself was actually staggering. And I stress that word staggering because he once said that anybody who has not been staggered will never understand my theory. Staggered by the huge age of the Earth compared with the few thousand years of early Christian tradition. Staggered by the sheer extent of the extinction. Staggered by the great diversity of biological forms as you move from one region to another. And I often think that many of the theological commentators on evolution, both in the 19th century and right up until the present, have not been staggered, and therefore they don't actually see the full force of what Darwin was saying. Actually, just a personal anecdote, I was giving a lecture very recently in St Andrews University, and in the discussion following the lecture, it became clear to me that there were one or two religious thinkers present who freely admitted that they had never even thought before about the problem of extinction. You know, why would a good, caring, benevolent God allow his own creations to be discarded by whatever process? So I would never want to associate myself with those who try to minimize the impact of the historical sciences, not just evolutionary biology, geology as well, historical study of the Bible also contributing to new possibilities for secular perspectives and arguments. On the other hand, and the story from my point of view is always complicated, but on the other hand, it's easy to overlook those religious thinkers who did not come out against Darwin, baying for his blood. I think there were numerous intellectuals within the Anglican Church who could see in what Darwin was proposing the prospects of a more sophisticated understanding of God's relationship to nature. And by more sophisticated, I mean breaking away from that simple view that God somehow interacts with the world by intervening from outside. And it's very easy to have that popular image of a world that basically runs by itself, but every now and again God dives in to work a miracle or to create some kind of innovation that would not have happened otherwise. I think evolutionary biology, through Darwin and his various disciples, it underlined the fact that that image of an interfering deity was actually rather naive. It even had the theological drawback that if God had created every creature separately by some kind of miraculous intervention, then the deity is responsible for the characteristics of each of those creatures. Many of which, and Darwin certainly thought this, many of which were pretty vile and repulsive. I mean, he doesn't like mollusks very much, for example. He didn't like the ichneumon wasp, which lays its eggs in the bodies of caterpillars. And then you get the gruesome consequence that when the eggs hatch, the caterpillar just gets devoured by the wasp. So there are features of the natural world which are almost demonic. I mean, Darwin says what a book a devil's chaplain might write about the horribly cruel and wasteful works of nature. But if you adopt an evolutionary view and you see divine activity not as kind of miraculous intervention in nature, but somehow working through natural processes, not in opposition to them, then as a mode of creation, just using the theological language for a moment, you could argue that a world in which it is possible for human beings with all their attributes to develop, a world in which it is possible for humans to develop, is a world in which it is also possible that there will be vile mollusks and vicious insects. And in that way, Darwin himself glimpses the possibility that his science could actually be, in a strange kind of way, a gift to theology, because it offers the prospect of some kind of theodicy, of helping to understand the amount of suffering in the world, if it is an inevitable part of a process that produces human beings. And I think that argument, where that Darwin's theory is seen as the foundation of a new theodicy, that argument certainly takes flight during the late 19th and early 20th century. So, a huge challenge, to be sure, but it would be wrong to say that the Darwinian theory destroys completely either natural theology or the attempt to make sense of the world theologically as well as scientifically.
Speaking of modes and complexities, you have written in several cases on the various modes of interaction between science and religion around the world. You have introduced coherently what we now call the Complexity Thesis, and you very recently co-edited a collection of essays that deal with science and religion as was seen by different cultures in various parts of the world. Would you like to offer some of the results of these projects as they have evolved over the years?
Okay, well, I do find myself designated as the author of the Complexity Thesis, as you describe it. And I know exactly why that is, because the book for which I'm best known, the Cambridge University book, Science and Religion, Some Historical Perspectives, in that book I was trying to show that the history of the relations between science and religion is more complicated than you would believe if you simply accepted either that science and religion have always been in conflict, or that in some deep sense they are and can be made to exist in perfect harmony. And in the 1980s, when I was writing that book, I was very conscious that much of the popular writing on science and religion fell in to one of those two modes, that a lot was written on the inevitability of conflict between science and religion. A lot was written in retaliation, along the lines that there can be perfect coexistence between the two when each is properly understood. And I felt, having become accustomed to what was a growing literature on the history of science, I just realized that those two extreme positions do not do justice to the complexity and the very rich and diverse ways in which scientific and religious thinkers have engaged in discussion. And often, of course, within the mind of a single person. Scientists have often themselves been deeply religious, not always orthodox, but very often deeply religious. And so to have science and religion set up in some kind of antithetical relationship, or even coexisting in harmony, just seemed to me inadequate. And I had one sentence in that book where I said the lesson from serious history, the lesson is the complexity. And my good friend Ronald Numbers, among others actually, began to attribute this complexity thesis to me. Well, it's very nice to have a thesis named after you or be associated with. But actually, the more I have thought about this, and the more I was thinking about it at the recent conference in Rio de Janeiro in the summer, when we were having a whole symposium devoted to the complexity thesis, the more I think about this, the more do I think we should talk about a complexity principle rather than a complexity thesis. Because complexity is a historical reality. the world is a complicated place. If you talk about a complexity thesis, it can very easily sound extraordinarily trivial. What are you claiming when you say, the history shows that there is complexity? It's what historians more or less take for granted, even if scientists and theologians perhaps like not to do so in some way. So I see the complexity principle really as a principle of method. It's a methodological principle. It is a critique, and I agree with Peter Harrison about this. It should be seen as a critique of master narratives or meta-narratives, which try to compress very rich and interesting historical interactions just into some single mold. So I'm all for plurality and I'm all for complexity, and I think one should always come to the analysis of a historical controversy prepared to find complexity, rather than coming with some kind of agenda designed to place the discussion in one or other of these molds. And just to develop that point a little bit further, Ian Barber, whose work in science and religion is often, quite rightly, seen as having been in some sense foundational. I remember his book was another that had a great impact on me when I read it. He has become associated with the view that there can be four relationships between science and religion: conflict, integration, dialogue, independence. What he doesn't always make quite clear is that it can be all four. And for some scientists, it's been all four simultaneously, depending on what particular issue they're thinking about. What worries me about references to a complexity thesis is that it almost implies that you could replace conflict, harmony, integration, all those things, just replace it with the one word complexity. And I do not believe that is the right thing to do. And it seems to me, actually, if you take a complexity principle seriously, one of the things it must exclude is a complexity thesis, because that will have the tendency to reduce the analysis of these debates to one single proposition. So I'm very happy to be associated with the complexity arguments, but I am a little uneasy about complexity thesis, which can sound really rather trivial. In fact, it means very little to say something is complex unless you're prepared to examine it and say in what respects it is complex. And I think it's those respects that the historian has the duty to follow up. Perhaps one other thing that one should say about the complexity thesis is a criticism of it would be, and indeed has been, that if you focus on the importance of local contexts for discussions of science and religion or whatever, there is a great danger that you, well, we would say over here in England, of missing the wood for the trees. You lose sight of general trends because you're focused too much on the complexity of a local situation. And I think there is some truth in that criticism. But most of us who have written advocating a complexity-based historiography have gone out of our way to show that this doesn't mean that you lose sight of the big questions and the big trends. So I think scholars like Ron Numbers, and indeed I myself, have written on processes of secularization, processes of naturalization, looking for patterns and trends in the history. So it's an interesting objection to a historiography based on complexity. But I think that it would be a mistake for those who object in that way to suggest that we are not interested in the conflicts that have occurred in the past. And I can think of one or two actually quite recent books which seemed to imply that revisionist historians have just lost the plot because they've missed this long secular narrative about how science has displaced religion. I don't think we have lost that plot, and it would be very interesting to have some kind of discussion on that particular point. But I would still say, even if you focus on a trend like secularization, those who like to point to the way science has displaced religion, very often, it seems to me, give a simplistic account of secularization itself. They miss many of the more internal factors, internal to religion itself, which have given rise to more atheistic and naturalistic philosophies. I think for Francis Bacon, the strongest argument for atheism came from warring factions within religion, rather than from some alien scientific culture threatening the truth statements that were enshrined in that religion.
Moving on to a broader issue, and one of which, again, you've touched just now. How do you see the current status of the field of science and religion in its many dimensions? As far as one can tell, it has historical dimensions, philosophical, even sociological in many cases. How do you see the field being right now, and how do you see it moving forward in the future?
Well, I think one of the really encouraging things is that the way in which science and religion and their interconnectivity, when it exists, has been studied, has become much more diversified. There are more sociological studies now. Lots of surveys have been done in America, of a more global kind too, trying to discover the attitudes of scientists themselves on religious matters. There are sociological studies that are looking seriously at the more popular beliefs about science and religion. There are projects here in the UK looking at that at the moment. Elaine Eklund in the United States has done very substantial surveys about what people believe concerning conflict between science and religion. So I'm very glad that there is that sociological turn. I think the philosophical issues, of course, are still under discussion and will always be so. And I think there is interesting work all the time being done on that. I'm conscious, too, of the fact that historical scholarship is developing in probably interesting new ways, especially, I think, in the context that you mentioned of looking at other cultures than Western European Protestant Christian tradition. Of course, there's always been a huge literature on the Roman Catholic Church and the various difficulties it has had from time to time with scientific innovation. The Galileo case, of course, springs to everybody's mind in that context. In terms of how I think the subject might develop, we need to know very much more about how what we call science has been valued, interpreted, evaluated in different countries, but also in different cultures, and also between different traditions within a particular religion. So one of the things that has been interesting to me in the SAO project is just to learn rather more about how attitudes towards scientific study have varied or consolidated within the Eastern Orthodox tradition, compared with Catholicism, compared with the more Protestant Christian traditions, which have, I mean, in very general terms, been that much more dynamic in terms of wanting to change the world and wanting to improve it in various ways. And that's where there can be very interesting tensions, I think, between science and religion, in that if you take a science like chemistry, for example, the goal of many chemists has been to change the world, to create new compounds that will solve problems. The implication is that the world as we have it is not as improved as much as it might have been, and that for some carries all kinds of religious connotations. So what I'm saying there is I think there is scope for looking at individual sciences, particularly in the way they have dealt with that question of, is it sacrilegious to want to improve the world? And if you come to something like genetic engineering, you have a perfect example of how that question is actually causing quite a lot of anxiety in some circles. The Oxford Union is about to have a debate on the motion, this House believes that genetic engineering undermines human nature. That's a good debating topic, I think, and it will become more forcefully impressed upon the public as genetic engineering becomes more sophisticated. And the whole question of what it means to be human takes on a kind of higher profile. I've been lucky enough to attend conferences around Europe and elsewhere over the last 10 years or so. And in many centres of research, that topic, what does it mean to be human? What is it to be human? Currently has a very high profile. And it does so in part, of course, because of the development of robotics and artificial intelligence, and all the potential that that may have for enhancing human life, but also for seriously disrupting it. And questions about the dangers of super intelligence coming from machines rather than from ourselves, those dangers, I think, are bound to feature in future discussions of science, religion, morality. Another field which I think currently and in the future is likely to become of greater interest, though it certainly has been a topic of interest to many for centuries, is the question of extraterrestrial life. We're learning so much, so quickly, about what we call exoplanets, these satellites around other stars. And the question is, given that some of those satellites, some of those exoplanets will have similar kind of physical parameters to what has made life possible on Earth, it does greatly... Sorry about that.
Actually, with safety. That was my fault. Please continue.
So just thinking about the exoplanets, I think for many this raises the exciting prospect of having some kind of encounter with intelligent life elsewhere. I think thinking about this seriously, one's unlikely to have a particularly stimulating conversation with the inhabitants of other planets, which may be millions and millions and millions of light years away. But I think the questions that the discussion of extraterrestrial life raise for theology are of a very interesting nature. Are humans unique in the universe? Can there be intelligent life elsewhere? Do religious traditions feel threatened by that? Some people seem to think they ought to be. Others, and I'm thinking now of results of surveys conducted by Ted Peters in California, at the Center for Theology and Natural Sciences there in Berkeley. He issued a very interesting series of questionnaires to people from different religious traditions about whether their faith would be challenged if intelligent life were discovered on other worlds. And he got some very interesting results. One of the most interesting of which was that the most prominent view, when people were asked whether ET would damage their faith, the most prominent answer was no. And that was true in every religious tradition that he had engaged in the questionnaire. But, and this is the interesting point, in I think every case the reply was no, but I can imagine it being a problem for people in other religious traditions. So this I find actually rather interesting, this sense somehow of the superiority of one's own religious tradition, which has the resources, the sophisticated apparatus to be able to deal with scientific innovation and discovery, but the suspicion that perhaps other religions are some way behind when it comes to the really exciting developments. So there's much one could say about that. But those are just one or two fields where I think changes in science, advances in science, will create new areas of discourse. New insights from the study of different social, cultural traditions, where the words science and religion simply don't have the same resonances as they have in the West. I think Peter Harrison has done a fascinating job in his book on the territories of science and religion in showing how the two words have changed their meaning over the centuries. And so if you asked how did Isaac Newton harmonize his science with his religion, Peter Harrison would say, I would say, and Newton would say, I think, that just isn't a helpful question. Newton is talking about natural philosophy, not about science in the modern sense of a research, empirical science. And the word religion is, of course, a kind of theoretical construct developed principally during the 17th and 18th centuries, when people were trying to get a handle on the beliefs of other cultures. And to use a word like religion to try to encapsulate their particular rituals, their particular beliefs, their social practices. The need to do that helped to give that word religion a new kind of significance and a meaning away from what it had primarily been in the past, when the word was refining moral attitudes, duties, and responsibilities. So I think the future discussion of science and religion will have to do a lot more of that kind of linguistic analysis that Peter Harrison does so well when showing how these very words have changed their meaning over time.
You have been more or less one of the founders of the field of science and religion studies as we currently understand it, and you have been working on these issues for many decades now. If we focus on the Orthodox Christian tradition, do you consider that Orthodox Christianity has characteristics or has had characteristics that set it apart from other Christian denominations when considering its interaction with science? Or if we could put the same question another way, are there unique perspectives on science and or science and religion interactions that Orthodoxy could offer, or studies of Orthodoxy could offer, that have been overlooked or otherwise missing from Western Christian discussions?
I'm deeply interested by that question about whether Orthodoxy has some kind of unique characteristics that mean we have to discuss it separately from other features of the Christian tradition. It has occurred to me from the reading I've done on attitudes within Orthodoxy, and I must stress that I do not regard myself as a great expert on Orthodoxy. But I have suggested, I think in a paper that you heard yourself, that I do detect within Orthodoxy attitudes of indifference towards science, which I would simply say seem rather more pronounced than attitudes of indifference towards the sciences that I see in other Christian traditions. That's a rather negative conclusion, if it's correct. It may not be correct, but I think, see that within Orthodoxy there is a fairly well-defined set of spiritual priorities, which mean that, as we were saying earlier, the study of nature, serious analytical study of nature, is not seen as something that is actually edifying, important for the spiritual life. That the liturgy within the church is the focus of what human beings really need in order to have a cogent relationship, meaningful relationship with the God in whom they believe. Now, indifference towards science can certainly be found in the Catholic tradition and also in the Protestant traditions. What may be interesting is that in the Catholic and the Protestant Christian traditions, you will find a tension between liberals and conservatives over the place that should be given to reason and rational science, compared with revelation and the sacred canonical texts of the Church Fathers. I'm inclined to think that the Orthodox tradition, if I'm right that it has shown more indifference towards science, you will find less evidence of the hostility that you sometimes find among the reactionary elements within the other churches towards scientific innovation, which could give the impression that Orthodoxy has been kinder to science than, say, the Catholic Church, which has, to be sure, sometimes been very oppressive when it comes to challenging and threatening ideas. I see something parallel to this in the Islamic engagement with science, particularly the new astronomy, the 16th, 17th centuries, when the Earth gets spinning round the sun rather than being static at the center of the universe. And I remember hearing Islamic scholars making the point that there was nothing in Islam to compare with what the Catholic Church did to Galileo. The implication being that Islam was more tolerant of science. It may have been, by the 16th and 17th centuries, increasingly indifferent. That is, following a much earlier period when it was very far from indifferent, because, there is a huge literature produced by Islamic scholars on the natural world, particularly in astronomy, optics, mathematics. But the argument that I've heard is that Islam was more tolerant of science than Christianity, because look, there is no equivalent of the trial of Galileo within Islam. But I feel uncomfortable about an argument like that, because much depended, when you were thinking about the motion of the Earth, much depended on whether this was a physical hypothesis. Is it a proposition that the Earth does physically orbit the Sun? Or was it simply a more sophisticated mathematical model enabling you to predict the positions of the planets and so give rise to calendar reform and that kind of thing? Was it perhaps just mathematically more sophisticated? In which case you don't even have to consider the question of whether it conflicts with the Quran, or in the case of Christianity, with the Bible. So what I think I'm suggesting here is that we have to be rather careful about generalizations which might suggest that specific traditions are more tolerant than others of scientific innovation. There may be ulterior reasons why you don't find an explicit opposition that we do sometimes see, certainly with the Roman Catholic tradition and within conservative Protestant circles. I mean, obviously, a modern example would be the extreme resistance to Darwinian evolution among United States fundamentalist evangelicals, for whom Darwin is a demon, and a figure who was somehow complicit in the awful manifestos of Hitler and the Third Reich. People, when they are attacking science they don't like, can become very aggressive. And I think, one does just have to see that there's a whole range of attitudes you find within every tradition. You asked a question specifically about orthodoxy and whether I see unique features. I can see that there might be an argument, and I think my friend Chris Knight has articulated this argument, for saying that you can find among the Greek fathers, for example, a view of God's relationship to nature, which is sometimes called panentheism. That means not pantheism, where God and nature are one, but panentheism, in which all that exists in God. Now, I'm not sufficient of a scholar when it comes to the texts of the early Christian fathers to say whether I think that is an accurate view. But it is certainly true that that panentheistic view has found favour among scientists, quite a number of scholars who work in the science and religion area, because it avoids that kind of deistic view I mentioned earlier, where you have a God who is forever intervening in nature. If everything exists in God, so the argument would go, you don't need to have that image of an interfering God. There is a much more subtle relationship between nature. Nature would indeed, on one level, have a certain kind of autonomy, even though it's within the body, if you like, of God. It is interesting that some of the great scientists of the 17th century took an interest in that kind of theology. Isaac Newton, for example, sees a very intimate relation between nature and the God in whom nature exists. So, for example, Newton sees and understands space to be God's presence in the world. There is a link between God's omnipresence and the absolute character of space. That's in Newton's theology. So it seems to me you might be able to construct an argument which would say that orthodoxy could encourage other religious traditions to look more closely at that kind of panentheistic understanding of the relationship between nature to God than the rather tired models that we have had in Western Christianity, where you tend to get either a full theism where God is active in everything and sustaining everything, or a deism where God creates the world and then leaves it to its own devices, and that semi-deism where God is intervening all the time. And what I'm suggesting here is that that panentheistic view, which has been seen in the work of the Church Fathers, might have something useful to contribute.
Following up on this question, what areas would you consider to be especially underexplored in the Orthodox Christianity science interaction? Or to put it another way, what kind of work or scholarship would you like to see in the future concerning the Orthodox Christianity science interactions?
Reflecting on possible future work on orthodoxy and science, I have been made aware of a concern, actually, that scientists are quite reluctant to talk about the implications for orthodoxy of more radical scientific theories. So let's just take the Darwinian theory again as an example. I have read books which suggest that because of the very close linkage between the Orthodox Church and national identity in countries like Greece, and I guess in Russia too, because of that, there is a worry that very real issues on the border of science and religion are simply being passed over rather than critically engaged. And that would mean critically engaged from scientists as well as theologians. If there is some kind of inhibiting factor from the particular culture we're talking about, then it seems to me that needs to be investigated more fully itself. why should there be so much anxiety? I mean, is it really the case that the Orthodox Church in Greece wields such power that scientists would feel that they were at risk from some kind of social persecution or even political persecution? I don't know the answers to that, but I do just pick up these vibrations that, particularly because of the way Orthodoxy has been bound to ideas of national identity, the issues take on an extra political dimension because of that. And I would like to know rather more about that. And I feel serious historical analysis, but also direct engagement between scientists and Orthodox thinkers, just to try to sort out what the problems really are, rather than just pretending they don't exist. I don't know whether that makes any sense to you, Kostas, but that does concern me.
I only have a couple of questions more. What are or should be, from your point of view, the limits of the dialogue or the interaction between science and religion?
When I'm asked about dialogue between science and religion, I begin to worry, just as I do when I'm associated with the Complexity Thesis. I don't myself like the way that Ian Barber introduced dialogue as one of the modes of relationship between science and religion. There is a certain sense in which there cannot be dialogue between science and religion. They are both abstractions, those two words. There can be dialogue between people, some of whom may be religious thinkers, some of whom may be scientists, some of whom may be both. You can have dialogue between people, but I don't like this abstraction of dialogue. And I think it's encouraged some authors to point out that really there is a sense in which dialogue is impossible. Now, I would never say that, and I would never say that because I see from the history of science that even the most radical scientific thinkers, politically and religiously, have been engaged in some kind of dialogue with the tradition that they are either trying to improve or are renouncing. Dialogue between people, even between two variants of the same person, just to be really radical for a moment. We're all in various ways in dialogue with our former selves when we ask these big questions about the meaning of life. I just think that nothing is lost, and perhaps there's a lot to be gained, where it's clear there is misunderstanding, both misunderstanding by theologians of what scientists are saying about the world, and misunderstanding when scientists caricature religious belief, as they so often do, describing it sometimes as believing what you know is not true, or believing what you cannot prove. These kind of common caricatures, I think they do need to be corrected. And for one, and this is an example which I have certainly witnessed for myself, there are people, particularly I think among the so-called new atheists, who have been deeply critical of the Templeton Foundation because they see it as having an agenda which certainly doesn't match their own, because the attempt to eradicate religion from the world which is the new atheist agenda, doesn't sit comfortably with the notion that through scientific progress there can actually be progress in religion, which was John Templeton's, Sir John's own view. I think actually it would be very helpful if there were a serious discussion between members of the Templeton Foundation and their critics like Dan Dennett or Richard Dawkins. Because what I hear are caricatures on both sides, as a matter of fact. And wherever you get that caricaturing, I think there is a role for the historian, for the philosopher, to try to bang heads together a bit and try to sort out some of the discrepancies that do come to the fore.
As a last question, I'd like to ask which scholars or intellectuals or thinkers would you identify as being especially prominent in the contemporary science and religion research or field? Apart from you.
Well, I wasn't going to mention myself, of course.
This is why I did it.
I hesitate to do that for one very important reason, that research in this area is ongoing. There are young scholars doing excellent work, but whose work has probably not yet hit the headlines because it takes a long time to develop a reputation for working in what is, after all, a very difficult area, because it is interdisciplinary. It requires, I think, historical, philosophical, scientific and theological training at one level or another to be able to engage meaningfully in this. So I'm a little bit hesitant to pick names out of the hat, because I think that could be unfair to people who are just about to publish a book that might be of very serious import. I can think, just to justify this before I do try to answer the question, I have known scholars in the past. I had one in my history department life in Lancaster, whom people rather pitied because he seemed to be spending hours and hours and hours, days and days and days, nights and nights and nights, working on a big book, and it never seemed to come out. And when it finally did, it was regarded as a great masterpiece, and he enjoyed enormous renown among his peers because of that, which has always made me cautious about forming judgments too prematurely about the quality of people's work. Now, a proper answer to your question, of course, would have to say, who are the philosophers who are doing some of the best work in this field? Who are the historians who are doing the best work? Who are the theologians? And I am only deeply familiar with the work being done in the history, because that happens to be my main specialism. I think there is a sense, and I see this among some younger scholars. I will mention a name, Michael Burdett in Oxford, has written a very interesting paper suggesting that the work that has been done by those of us who are sometimes described as founders of the field has been done by people who are on the verge of retirement. Actually, one might even say on the verge of departure, but one hesitates to do that. The implication is that there are new things both necessary and happening. And Michael's view certainly is that there needs to be more sociology, that there needs to be more study of other cultures. These are things we have touched on in our discussion. If I'm thinking of the historians, then I have enormous respect for Peter Harrison, whom I've mentioned, who was my successor to the Idrios chair in Oxford, and is hugely productive and always analyses the issues from an informed linguistic point of view. I'm hopeful that my good friend Ronald Numbers will continue to be a star in this field. I have every confidence that that will be so. The current occupant of the Idrios chair in Oxford, Alistair McGrath, of course, is a celebrated figure who has published an immense number of books which in various ways touch on the discourse of science and religion. Still with the historians, and I'm afraid this does begin to sound rather Oxbridge-centred, but the current professor of the history of science in Oxford, Robert Iliff, recently published a biography of Isaac Newton, which I think is called something like The Scientist as Priest. The title is something like that.
Priest of Nature.
Priest of Nature, thank you. Now, he's a brilliant scholar, and he's done more, I think, to get Newtonian manuscripts on alchemy, theology, onto the web. So he is an example of a scholar now occupying a prestigious chair in Oxford, the History of Science chair, who is working on science and religion and doing outstanding work. In the United States, I have always been impressed by a guy at Johns Hopkins University, Larry Principe, who writes on alchemy, early chemistry, but has published quite a lot of things in the area of science and religion. And I would always rate him highly. So I could carry on enumerating. And I think the purpose of so doing would just be to indicate that we're not here talking about a field that is drying up, but there is a great spread of interest, both in the early modern period, the Enlightenment, and in 20th century studies. I guess a concern I might have is that on 20th century science and religion, there has been relatively little done compared with earlier periods. And so I would be looking for people to do rather more work in that particular period. Other scholars around the world who would fit into the kind of categories we were discussing. Philip Clayton has been very active, very prolific in the work he has done in science and religion. Philosophers like Michael Ruse, particularly in the philosophy of biology, evolutionary theory. He's recently published a book with the title Darwinism as a Religion, or Darwinism as Religion. That's a very interesting study of post-Darwinian literature, in which the Darwinian thesis is appropriated almost as a kind of substitute religion for Christianity. As long as there are philosophers like Michael, who, however atheistic they may be, still show respect for the people they are studying, I think the future is very bright for work in this area.
So, I would like to thank you very much for your time and for your very coherent, erudite answers to our questions. Thank you for having us here, and it was a pleasure discussing these things with you. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.